Today we are going to go back in time to the era of Assassin's Creed 3, and I, Degenerate J, will be your guide on this journey backwards to the era of the PlayStation Vita, a very interesting handheld that held a very interesting exclusive Assassin's Creed game that was then ported to PC and then ported to Xbox and PlayStation, and it wasn't exclusive for long, but Assassin's Creed Liberation is a very odd duck in the franchise. Now, when it comes to the Assassin's Creed series, I can't say I've played too many overwhelmingly weird games. I suppose technically the whole series is a little weird, since it does deal with mysticism and science fiction technology, but the games are fairly straightforward. Usually you're an assassin, and rarely a Templar, climbing and running through an open world and taking part in historical events. There's always a lot of particular details that separate each game and make them all unique, but there's also a fairly easy way to understand the storylines that carry the elements through the games. Assassin's Creed Liberation is a unique title because it has a lot of those elements, but they don't fully come together to form a cohesive final product. It's just a complete mixed bag. Before we hop further into it, if you do enjoy today's video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more videos. We cover a lot of RPGs, JRPGs, I do a lot of superhero content, James Bond, Metal Gear. There's all kinds of fun stuff here, so I hope you'll join us for the ride, but we'll hop back into it because I appreciate you hearing me out. Assassin's Creed Liberation follows the story of a young assassin named Aveline de Grand Prix, who is living in late 18th century French Louisiana. Now, the game mainly takes place in a mixture of two settings, the city of New Orleans and the Louisiana Bayou. To say that this game clearly had technical and budget limitations is going to be a massive understatement, and I've played wonky and glitchy Assassin's Creed games. They don't usually bother me. AC3 and 4 both, despite being some of my favorite games in the franchise, had a lot of bugs and glitches. It's very clear that Ubisoft needed to take some more time in this era to actually cook these games in the oven. They were pushing them out a little too quickly, and it was leaving them with a lot of technical problems. But when it came to this game, I don't think it's even that as much as they were biting off more than they could chew. They were trying to create a console Assassin's Creed experience on a handheld, and it led to a lot of frustrating elements in this game. At its core, it's very obvious that there was an attempt to make a very good game with this title. There are multiple unique gameplay mechanics that were fairly experimental for the series introduced in it, including the persona-based system of disguises. I actually love this system, and during the game, Aveline is balancing two worlds. During the day, she's often Aveline de Grand Prix, the daughter of an esteemed and successful businessman. She walks around in beautiful dresses and mingles with socialites, and she's kind of a sought-after girl, okay? This is the kind of girl that, you would see in a story like Aladdin, where it's like this beautiful princess type. However, at night or during the days where that version of her isn't required, she's roaming the rooftops of New Orleans or the tree lines of the bayou as Aveline the Assassin. She's also able to disguise herself as a slave, as she is actually half black, and this is taking place during the 18th century. And those disguises, all three of them, they allow for unique missions and abilities. These personas do play well into the storyline of the game, and they are a very fun mechanic. I wish they would return to the series in some way. There are still disguises in later games and earlier games, but they're usually situational, or something a character will change into for a given mission that's scripted and then revert out of. In Liberation, the system is actually different, as a player can visit dressing rooms to switch personas during the game to tackle different obstacles and deal with a bunch of different missions that work for each version of the character. The unfortunate part of this system, though, is that the actual execution of it is not as fleshed out as it could have been. Many persona-based missions are either very boring or very aimless outside of the main story. There's an entire storyline in this game that really isn't even voiced at all, where there was an arbitrary plot by a group of nameless thugs to kidnap Aveline. But the payoff is extremely anticlimactic, and the mission chain could have been cut entirely without changing much of anything in the game. It actually felt like it was a fan-made level, I would say, from something like Infamous 2. I don't know if anyone remembers the old Infamous 2 fan-generated content where players could create their own missions they were not voiced and they essentially would have you run on a wild goose chase, kill a couple of people, and then move on. That's genuinely what this mission chain was, except it wasn't fan designed or, anything like that. It was content in the game that was supposed to enhance the game. One of the biggest missed opportunities of this game, though, is the selection of side missions. In most AC games, I think they're really fun. The side missions will play into the strengths of the storyline, or they will actually flesh out its weaknesses and add meat to the bones by improving areas the main story couldn't dive enough into. A great example of this that I've already made an entire video on is the Frontier and Homestead missions of AC3. Now, the main story deals a lot with identity and the Revolutionary War and the events around Connor, but it sometimes fails to get enough into his relationships with others. But that's actually fixed a lot and compensated for in the Homestead and Frontier missions, which focus more on the personal side of Connor as he was dealing with people directly under his care. This idea of side content actually helping the main character grow and be more interesting is pretty much non-existent in Liberation. It just doesn't really happen. Almost all of Aveline's development, which is already somewhat limited, comes through the main story, and it feels like the side content is just there to pad out the game, maybe justify a price point or the persona system existing, but it makes the system feel relatively pointless at times if nothing's gonna come from it except the main story. It's a huge shame to see such a unique idea wasted. I mean, it doesn't help that the cosmetic options for the character are also very lackluster. Almost every costume variant in the game is just a palette swap, with only a few unique options being available at the end of the game after you've run your patience dry by doing boring collectible missions. The Bayou Hunter outfit is very unique and interesting, and I'll give them props for that, but you really don't end up getting these things until later on in the game and you're pretty much done, which makes the inclusion of them feel a little pointless unless you're going to go back into previous memories to play around with them just for fun. What frustrates me about this is that the gameplay of some of these personas is very unique. So playing as the lady gives Aveline access to an umbrella weapon that she can use to shoot poison or berserk darts out secretly, and she walks elegantly and beautifully in comparison to the actions of maybe playing as an assassin. Now, this is one of the biggest triumphs of this game, is its actual use of social stealth. If you want to blend in with common people, you put on a slave disguise and you just walk around New Orleans, or if you want to blend in more with socialites, you wear your more ritzy lady persona, and you actually have access to a really fun, unique weapon in this game, which is an umbrella or parasol, or whatever you want to call it, that Aveline can use to actually shoot poison or berserk darts out of. It's really cool and really unique, and she's actually even able to charm men to get gifts or get guard escorts to walk into restricted areas as the lady. So these things are really interesting. They're very, very fun. If you want to do some old-fashioned deadly killing and rooftop sprinting, just play as the assassin. It's such an enjoyable system when you're actually able to use it and engage with good content, and the series would benefit from revisiting this in a better game. It's one of the more unique and interesting mechanics in the entire series, and I don't understand why you wouldn't go back to this. I mean, why was it introduced in a smaller side game for a handheld and then never revisited? It makes no sense. It's such a great example of social stealth that could work in pretty much any game where there is a caste system or a class system or any different types of social hierarchy or system, which those pretty much exist in every single country, in every society across all of history. So there's always the option to be able to use disguises to appear like a different person and interact with the world differently. It's very, very weird to me that it's such a missed opportunity that AC never really revisits in a meaningful way. The setting of the game has a lot of positives and a lot of negatives. I mean, New Orleans itself in real life has a ton of personality, but in this game, it doesn't really have much. It's clearly just a smaller version and combination of elements of New York and Boston from Assassin's Creed 3. And while I am glad this city is somewhat unique, in the sense that it wasn't just a reused location, it's not just like they dropped Boston in and called it New Orleans, there's not much actually separating it from those cities in AC3. It's very, very small. I suppose that's different, but those settings seem more intricately and purposely designed than New Orleans does. The bayou itself, though, is much better. It's a more fascinating swamp setting, and it actually takes advantage of the tree climbing mechanics from AC3. I actually really enjoyed my time there. I thought that the game design in the bayou was more clever and unique than it was in New Orleans. The developers were actually trying to give Aveline her own take on the frontier from AC3, and I do think they did a good job with that, as there are several different massive trees and landmarks that you're able to climb. Some of these trees work as viewpoints, and they're much larger than the ones that Connor scales in AC3. I was surprised by the scope of them, but sometimes the climbing on them is extremely wonky. It's not exactly the most fluid climbing system in Assassin's Creed. Still really cool setting, but the way that the character interacts with it gameplay-wise sometimes leaves a little bit to be desired, which we're going to get into as well. The canoes are an example of that. It's very cool, but it's so glitchy and the controls are ridiculously poor. I'm not sure if the canoes and the glitchiness were worse in the Vita version. I know that there was even worse glitchiness in the PC version back in the day, but I heard that the bugs were actually toned down for this HD remaster that I was playing, which was the Xbox One version of AC3 that came with this. So I can only imagine the issue probably was worse than it is now back in the, when this game came out. I guess I shouldn't say back in the day, it's not that old, but when you actually look at canoes, something that was revealed by the Assassin's Creed Twitter in 2022 now makes a lot more sense to me. These canoes were actually piloted by alligators that were pretty much invisible under the water that you can't see normally. I'm not sure if they're actually invisible, I just know that they are positioned in a way where you can't really see them. But basically the devs used the alligators in-game that can swim and maneuver on the terrain in the bayou to add the same mechanics to the canoes by putting them under the canoes that you are able to pilot. So essentially you're piloting a canoe on the back of a non-visible alligator because it was a shortcut they used to get these mechanics working, but it didn't really pan out fully. They don't work very well. I'm sure this partially had to do with time constraints, and I will say I applaud the ingenuity and creativity to get the mechanic working, but it didn't end up working very well. Honestly, this felt a lot like the canoes from Assassin's Creed 2, but somehow they were even harder to use than that game that came out many years earlier. Even getting out of the canoes is sometimes a struggle for the player. Aveline will just get stuck glitching back in place with the game thinking you want to try and climb the canoe like it's a building. I really don't understand why this was such a hard thing to implement. I will say I feel like my review of this game comes off very negative, but it's not that I hate the game or anything, it's just that it's such a missed opportunity when it comes to the overall finished product and how everything ties together. One half of the settings is mediocre. It could have been improved a ton by the Persona system, but the system's not fully taken advantage of there, and it's just kind of pushed onto the player instead of being fluidly incorporated. It's just like, hey, you should change to this persona. Why? Because this mission requires it. Oh, is there a reason why the mission requires it? Are there good choices in the mission? No. You should just play as the slave, because we want to justify it being here. Most of the missions in the game that use the Persona system, they don't really justify its use or use it well. I would say it's maybe a halvesies thing, like half of the missions use it very well, and they are well done in terms of the main story, and the other half, it just kind of feels forced. It's really forced though in the side missions. But then you get into the other setting, which is the bayou, like I said, and it's done very well, but it's so wrought with glitches, climbing issues, canoe issues. It just, the traversal suffers for it, and there's not actually much content in it compared to what you would think. Overall, the game feels like a stripped down version of AC3, and it feels like Aveline could have used a little more respect. I almost would recommend someone plays AC3 after this game, even though it came out first. AC3 came out before the game, but I don't know. It's like you're setting yourself up for lower expectations almost. If it weren't for one particular scene in this game, I think it would be really good to just play it before AC3, but that particular scene ties into AC3 in a weird way. I'm almost surprised that this wasn't marketed and developed and released as a small experience preceding AC3, not following it, like how Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes came out and led into the Phantom Pain. or how Kingdom Hearts made Fragmentary Passage, and that led into KH3 as kind of a prequel or a little prelude, fun test demo type thing. This almost feels like a backwards release, where a much more impressive game came out first, and then a less impressive diet version of the game with some really unique mechanics launched using those building blocks from 3, but then it feels like it doesn't live up to it. A great example of missed opportunities on the building blocks is the hunting system. For some reason, a tiny portion of the hunting system does return in Liberation, but it doesn't make any sense to interact with. There's really no point to it. While you're in the bayou, you can encounter alligators and end up having to fight them and kill them in order to collect their eggs, but there's no real logic to this and why you're doing it. They kind of play it off like the alligators are bothering the settlers, which, okay, fine, but Aveline doesn't even skin the alligators or use their parts for anything, which I guess it sort of makes sense because Connor was Native American. You know, they have a very spiritual connection to the earth. They don't just want to kill for no reason. So that does make sense. That's going to be different than settlers in this time period. But the problem with it is that it doesn't make for good gameplay. It's a bit backwards of an inclusion to actually include hunting if it's only of one animal and there's nothing really to be gained from it. They stripped out so much of the heart and soul of this mechanic that there was really no point to include it, and it seemed like they only included it because they remembered last minute that alligators existed in the bayou, and so there was no logical way to not have them existing there. There are some raccoons running around. There's really no reason to interact with them. It's actually odd how few animals there are in this game. I would assume it has to do with time constraints, it originally being on a portable system and everything. It's in stark contrast to the real New Orleans, though, and the Louisiana Bayou, which is full of life even to this day, and I think that hurts the personality of the game itself. It just feels kind of dead because of it. Where this game excels and deserves credit is Aveline. We already talked about the Persona system. I think that deserves a bunch of credit for its amazing ideas that should have been brought back, but Aveline herself, I really like her a lot. Now, call me a simp a little bit when it comes to sexy female characters that kick ass, but the thing I like about Aveline is that she's multifaceted. She's interesting and she's charming. She's also a bit of a baddie, all right? I'm gonna be honest with you, she's a bit of a baddie, all right? You know what channel you're on, I'm gonna admit it. I'm attracted to this fictional woman. She's this beautiful woman who's dealing with multiple worlds at the same time. She's expected to be this dainty little beautiful socialite who, at this point in history, should just kind of find a man and settle down. That's what, society was telling her. But meanwhile, she is also balancing her responsibilities as an assassin, and she runs a business. This sounds like a strong, independent woman who don't need no man type thing, but it's not forced like that. It's not like she's a perfect character that has no problems, and she was just written to be the strong, independent woman archetype that we see in a lot of lazy media. She's actually a very well fleshed out character when it comes to parts of her. The problem is that other parts of her really could have used more development. As a young woman, she was rescued by an assassin and she became one herself. She has a very unique interaction and relationship with this assassin, but we don't actually get into it quite enough because of the game's length. It felt like it was balancing too many storylines between a storyline involving this assassin, a storyline involving the Templars, a storyline involving Aveline's mother, a storyline involving the declining health of her father, a storyline involving the supposed relationship between her and another character that never really goes anywhere and should have been more fleshed out. There was almost like too many little bits of the storyline that were spread out. They were trying to cover too much in a small game. One thing that's interesting here is the Brotherhood is not actually huge in the New Orleans area, which gives you a feeling that you're on your own, kind of similar to Assassin's Creed 2 in that way. Her character is very interesting though. Aveline is well done, I think, in a lot of ways, but I really think the game suffered from its length, including her development. Most of the story ends up centered around what Aveline is doing, not actually the character herself. It's kind of centered around where you're going, what you're doing. You see a lot of this in Aveline from her point of view, but with so many time skips, you're usually just jumping ahead to a later point and missing a lot of the conflict that Aveline would actually have in between these events that she would have to deal with. The relationships that Aveline has with other characters, such as her mother, her mother-in-law, her father, Gerald, who very clearly is into her, all of these relationships are interesting, but they're not really super fleshed out. You just see bits and pieces of them and they're not fully explored, and I think that that's really disappointing. especially the story around Aveline's mother, most of which is actually hidden in collectible letters that many players are never going to bother getting, leaving people who don't 100% the game lacking a lot of essential story to care about and understand one of the game's key conflicts. I just think most of the writing in this game could have been done a lot better and incorporated more into the main story and side missions so that players would have connected more with Aveline and her adventure. You know, she reminds me a lot of Xiao Jun, where there's so much more you could do with this character, but for some reason Ubisoft was like, let's make this character, let's do just enough, and then let's ignore them. At least Xiao Jun got a manga and has appeared in other things, but with Aveline, she's just kind of dumped. It's just, this character doesn't matter for some reason after this game, and she actually was impactful in some ways and could have been more interesting. Now, I don't want to get in trouble again like I did when I defended Assassin's Creed Mirage for having animus glitches in the game, even though a lot of other games do. But I think I just found something that's going to make the Assassin's Creed realism bros cringe and probably just shit their pants. I mean, this guy was yeeted into the atmosphere. I think he became one with the universe, and then God spit him back out and sent him back to Earth. This dude left our mortal realm, and he's now back, and he ain't going nowhere. I guess I left Liberation mostly frustrated. It's such a short game, but it felt long because of how disjointed the experience was. There's so many amazing ideas in the game. The persona system I keep bringing up, but it doesn't have as many uses as it should, and the gameplay mechanics really should have returned in later, more fleshed out games, but they just ended up abandoned. The Bayou was fun, but also clearly a diet version of the Frontier from AC3. There was also a random incorporation of Connor into this game, at which point I was like, ooh, Connor, I love this character, and then he just kind of shows up and leaves within 15 minutes and doesn't matter, and it's really the only thing that ties this into AC3 at all. So that felt like a big missed opportunity. Most of the costumes in the game are just color changes, with only a few feeling unique at all. It felt like for every good thing in the game that I can list, there was equally something dragging it down and holding it back. You know, the saying, one step forward, two steps back, it almost applies entirely to everything in Liberation, and I don't understand why it had to. I wanted to love Liberation. I don't have super high standards when it comes to the AC series. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm not critical at all and I just slurp up every game, but most Assassin's Creed games I end up either really enjoying or loving. Liberation I just kinda like. It's fine. I don't really know when I would want to replay it because there's not really that much to gain from the overall game. And it bothers me because Aveline's so cool. She seems like she deserved a lot better. So I don't hate it, I don't love it, I just wish they had done more with it and fleshed it out and made it better. This character deserved more. I feel like this setting deserves more. You know, the Bayou and New Orleans are much more interesting than they are portrayed here in real life, even at this time in history. And I guess it's just a shame to me that this is kind of the end product that people got, and probably the main time that the Bayou and New Orleans will ever really appear in an Assassin's Creed game. In a spin-off side game that didn't really live up to its potential. If you did enjoy today's review, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more content. It actually helps me out a lot and I really do appreciate it. I've played through some Assassin's Creed games over on my other channel, Degenerate Plays, as well, and the link to that is in the description of this video. If you're interested in supporting my channels further, we do have a channel membership program with exclusive videos, along with a Patreon option, which has the same. Those both help us out a ton. We also do have our own store, which is found at degeneratej.com. That is actually a store called Enchanted Glamour that's run by my wife, Jill, and we find and repurpose damaged comic books, manga, and other things that are really fun. We take the paper that's being thrown out, it usually ends up in landfills, it's not even usually recycled by shops, which is a shame, and we actually turn these things into fun resin coasters that preserve those pages. We also make keychains and more in transformative ways, and my wife also makes really awesome handmade jewelry, which is sold on that site. Some of it's one of a kind, some of it is repeated, you know, able to be bought more than once, but any purchases you buy go to help support this channel, and they really do help us out a lot. YouTube is very, very uncertain, very unstable when it comes to making content, and especially for channels like mine that are more variety, that cover things like superheroes, RPGs, JRPGs, Assassin's Creed, Fallout, James Bond. There's a lot of things we cover on this channel. Metal Gear. Channels like this that cover all these things, they don't really get pushed in the algorithm anymore. It's not really personality based anymore. where you'll see everything I upload. So checking back on the channel, subscribing, doing stuff like that, turning on that bell notification if you enjoy this stuff to maybe see more often, even though it doesn't work all the time, YouTube, those things help us out. So we appreciate you very much. Have a fantastic day. And as always, everyone, stay shui.